The adventures of Paddington, the bear from darkest Peru, are endless and endlessly popular. He's called Paddington because it was on Paddington Station in London that he was found by Mr. and Mrs. Brown when he first came to England. They took him home, and ever since he's lived with them and their two children, Judy and Jonathan, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Bird. All the stories you're going to hear now come from Michael Bond's book, Paddington Goes to Town.
Mr. Brown lowered his evening paper and looked around the room at the rest of the family. "Do you realise something?" he said. "It's nearly Christmas and we haven't been up to town to see the decorations yet." Paddington pricked up his ears at Mr. Brown's words. "I don't think I've ever been to see them, Mr. Brown," he said. "Not the Christmas ones." The Browns stopped what they were doing and stared at him in wide-eyed amazement. "Mercy me, I do believe that bear's right," said Mrs. Bird, the housekeeper. "Gosh, Dad," exclaimed Jonathan, "can we go tonight? It's years since we went." Mr. Brown glanced round the room with a twinkle in his eye. "What do you say, Paddington?" he asked. "Would you like to?" "Yes, please, Mr. Brown," exclaimed Paddington eagerly. "I should like that very much indeed." Paddington was always keen on trips, especially unexpected ones with the whole family. And when Mr. Brown announced that he would call in on the way and pick up Mr. Gruber, Paddington's special friend who had an antique shop nearby, he grew more and more excited. For the next half an hour, there was great pandemonium in number 32 Windsor Gardens as everyone rushed around getting ready for the big event. And even Paddington himself went so far as to rub a flannel over his whiskers, while Judy gave his fur a brush down. It was a very gay party of Browns that eventually set off in Mr. Brown's car, and shortly afterwards the hilarity was increased still further as Mr. Gruber emerged from his shop carrying a camera and some flash bulbs, several of which he used in order to take photographs of the assembly. "You're not the only one who hasn't been to see the Christmas decorations, Mr. Brown," he said, addressing Paddington as he squeezed into the back seat alongside Mrs. Bird, Jonathan and Judy. "I've never been either, and I want to make the most of it." As they drove along, Mr. Gruber went on to explain to Paddington how each year all the big shops in London got together in order to festoon the streets with huge decorations made up of hundreds of coloured lights, and also how each year an enormous Christmas tree was sent from Norway as a gift to the people of London, and how it was always placed in a position of honour in Trafalgar Square. It all sounded most interesting, and the excitement mounted as they drew nearer and nearer to the centre of London. Mr. Gruber coughed as Paddington jumped up in his seat and began waving his paws in the direction of a cluster of green lights some distance ahead. I have a feeling those are traffic lights, Mr. Brown," he said tactfully as they changed to amber. "But just you wait until you see the real thing." At that moment, the lights suddenly changed again, this time to red, and the car screeched to a halt. "I'm not surprised he mistook them," grumbled Mr. Brown. "It's a wonder he could see anything at all. If we're not careful, we shall have a nasty accident." Rather pointedly, he picked up a duster and began wiping the glass in front of him. "Bear's steam all over my windscreen. People will begin to think we're boiling a kettle in here or something." "Well, it's always worse when he's excited, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, coming to Paddington's rescue as he sank back into his seat looking most offended. "If I were you," she continued, "I'd stop somewhere. We shall see much more if we walk." It was a crisp, clear night, and the pavement on either side of the street was thronged with people gazing into shop windows, staring up at the decorations which seemed to hang overhead like a million golden stars in the sky, or simply, like the Browns, strolling leisurely along, drinking it all in. Nearby, on the Browns side of the street, a long queue of people were waiting to go into a cinema, and somewhere in the background there was the sound of a man's voice raised in song. A song punctuated every now and then by a rhythmic clicking like that of castanets. "I do believe it's someone playing the spoons, Mr. Brown," exclaimed Mr. Gruber. "I haven't seen that for years." Paddington, who'd never even heard of anyone playing the spoons before, let alone seen it happen, peered around with interest, while Mr. Gruber explained how some people who called themselves buskers earned their living by entertaining the theatre and cinema queues every evening while the people were waiting to go in. To Paddington's disappointment, the owner of the spoons appeared to be somewhere out of sight, round a corner, and so rather reluctantly he turned his attention back to the lights. There were so many different things to see, it was difficult to know which to investigate first, and he didn't want to run the risk of missing anything. But the Christmas lights themselves seemed very good value indeed. After considering the matter for a moment or two, he took off his hat so that the brim wouldn't get in the way, and then, holding it out in front of him, he hurried along the pavement after the others with his neck craned back so that he would have a better view. A little way along the street, he was suddenly brought back to earth when he bumped into Mr. Gruber, who'd stopped outside the entrance to the cinema in order to set up his camera on a tripod and make a record of the scene. Paddington was just staggering back after his collision when, to his surprise, a man in the front of the nearby queue leaned over and dropped a small, round, shiny object into his hat. "There you are," he said warmly. "Merry Christmas." "Thank you very much," exclaimed Paddington, looking most surprised. "Merry Christmas to you." Peering into his hat to see what the man had given him, he nearly fell over backwards onto the pavement in astonishment, and his eyes grew rounder and rounder as they took in the sight before them. For inside his hat was not just one, but a whole pile of coins. "Is anything the matter, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown, catching sight of the expression on his face. "You look quite—" And her voice broke off as she too caught a glimpse of the inside of Paddington's hat. "Good gracious!" She put a hand up to her mouth. "What have you been up to?" "I haven't been up to anything," said Paddington truthfully. "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan. "Don't say you've been collecting money from the queue." "They must have thought you were the man playing the spoons," said Judy in alarm. "Look here," said the man who just made the latest contribution to Paddington's collection. "I thought you were a busker." "A busker?" exclaimed Paddington, giving him a hard stare. "I'm not a busker. I'm a bear." "Well, in that case, I'd like my 10p back," said the man sternly. "Collecting money under false pretences." "Here, here," said a man with a muffler as he pushed his way to the front. "Came round with his hat, he did. Here, what about my 5p? Mrs. Brown looked around desperately as the murmurings in the front of the queue began to grow, and several people farther down the street began pointing in their direction. "Do something, Henry," she exclaimed. "Do something?" repeated Mr. Brown. "I don't see what I can do." "Came round with his hat, he did," repeated the man who was wearing the muffler. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Bird. "He only happened to be holding it in his paw. It's coming to something if a bear can't walk along a London street with his hat in his paw if he wants to." "Oh, dear," said Judy. "Look!" She pointed towards the tail end of the queue, where another argument appeared to be developing. It was centred around a man dressed in an old raincoat. He was holding an obviously empty hat in one hand while shaking his other fist at a group of people who, in turn, were pointing back up the street towards the Browns. "Crikey! We're for it now," breathed Jonathan as the man, having been joined by two stalwart policemen who'd been drawn to the scene by all the noise, turned and began heading in their direction. "That's him! That's him!" cried the busker, pointing an accusing finger at Paddington. "Trying to earn an honest bob to buy myself a loaf of bread for Christmas Day I was, and what happens? He comes round with his hat and robs me of all my takings." The first policeman took out his notebook. "Where do you come from, Bear?" he asked sternly. "Peru," said Paddington promptly. "Darkest Peru." "Number 32 Windsor Gardens," replied Mrs. Brown at the same time. The policeman looked from one to the other. "No fixed abode," he said ponderously as he licked his pencil. "No fixed abode," repeated Mrs. Bird. She took a firm grip of her umbrella and glared at the speaker. "I'll have you know that that young bear's abode has been fixed ever since he arrived in this country." The second policeman viewed Mrs. Bird's umbrella out of the corner of his eye and then glanced round at the rest of the Browns. "I must say, they don't look as if they've been working the queues," he said, addressing his colleague. "Working the queues?" said Mr. Brown indignantly. "We most certainly have been doing nothing of the kind. We came up to show this young bear the lights." "What about my takings, then?" interrupted the busker. "How did they come to be in his hat?" "Yeah, deliberate it was," shouted the man with the muffler. "Took my 5p, he did." "It certainly wasn't deliberate," said Mr. Gruber, stepping into the breach. "I saw the whole thing through my viewfinder. I happened to be taking a photograph at the time," he continued, turning to the first policeman in order to explain the matter. "And I am quite sure that when it's developed, you'll see this young bear is in no way to blame." Mr. Gruber looked as if he would like to have said a great deal more on the subject, but at that moment, to everyone's relief, a commissionaire appeared at the cinema doors and the queue began to move. "That's all very well," said the busker. "What about my takings? 2 choruses of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer I gave 'em on my spoons, and all for nothing." As the last of the queue disappeared into the cinema and the rest of the crowd began to disperse, the first policeman put his notebook away. "It seems to me," he said, turning to his colleague as they made to leave, "it seems to me, if this young bear here gives up his collection, everyone will be happy, and we can call it a night. Only look slippy, mind," he continued, addressing himself to Paddington. "Otherwise, if certain people are still here when we get back, they may find themselves in trouble for causing an obstruction." Thanking the policeman very much for his advice, Paddington began hastily emptying the contents of his hat into the one belonging to the busker. As the pile of coins cascaded down in a shower of bronze and silver, he began to look more and more disappointed. It was difficult to tell exactly how much was in the collection, but he felt sure it would have been more than enough to enable Jonathan, Judy, and himself to reach their target for the Children's Christmas Party Fund. "I don't know about no bears' targets," said the busker, as Paddington explained what he'd been hoping to do with the money. "I've got me own targets to worry about." "Never mind, Paddington," said Judy, squeezing his paw. "We've done very well. You never know. Something may turn up." "Tell you what," said the busker, catching sight of the expression on Paddington's face, "I'll give you a turn of me spoons to cheer you up before you go." Lifting up his hands, he was about to break into the opening bars when, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Gruber, who'd been listening to the conversation with a great deal of interest, suddenly stepped forward. "May I see those spoons a moment?" he asked. "Certainly, Gov," said the busker, handing them over. "Don't tell me you play them as well." Mr. Gruber shook his head as he took a small spyglass from his pocket and held the spoons up to a nearby lamp so that he could examine them more closely. "You know, these could be quite valuable. They may even be very rare Georgian silver." "What?" began the busker, staring open-mouthed at Mr. Gruber. "My spoons?" "I have an idea," said Mr. Gruber briskly, silencing the busker with a wave of his hand before he had time to say any more. "If I give you £5 for this pair of spoons, will you let young Mr. Brown keep the collection? After all, he did make it in a way, even if it was an accident." £5? exclaimed the busker, eyeing Mr. Gruber's wallet. "For them spoons? Lord bless you, sir. Why, he can have me hat as well for that." "No, thank you," broke in Mrs. Brown hastily. Paddington's own hat was bad enough at the best of times, but from where she was standing, it looked as if the busker's might well have matched up to it, give or take a few marmalade stains. "Tell you what, Gov," said the busker, hopefully, as he took Mr. Gruber's £5 note in exchange for the spoons and began transferring the money back into Paddington's hat. "Tell you what, there's some more where them two came from. How about—" Mr. Gruber gave him a hard look. "No," he said firmly. "I think these two will do admirably. Thank you." A few minutes later, bidding a rather dazed-looking busker goodbye, the Browns resumed their stroll, with Paddington keeping very much to the outside this time. "Well," said Mr. Brown, "I'm not quite sure what all that was about, but it seems to have worked out all right in the end." £1.82½, said Jonathan a few minutes later, as he'd finished counting the money. "That's more than enough to reach our target. I'll bet they'll be jolly pleased at the hospital." "I didn't know you were collecting for a children's party," said Mrs. Brown. "You should have said. We could have given you some towards it." "It was really Paddington's idea," said Judy, giving the paw by her side another squeeze. "Besides, it wouldn't have been the same if you'd given it to us. Not the same at all." Mr. Brown turned to Mr. Gruber. "Fancy you noticing those spoons," he said. "Isn't it strange how things work out?" "Very strange," agreed Mr. Gruber, taking a sudden interest in some decorations just overhead. Only Mrs. Bird caught a faint twinkle in his eye. A twinkle not unlike the one she'd noticed when he'd been conducting his deal with the busker, and one, moreover, which caused her to have certain suspicions on the matter. But wisely she decided it was high time the subject was changed. "Look," she said, pointing ahead. "There's the Christmas tree in Trafalgar Square. Now, if we hurry, we may be in time for the carols." Mr. Brown gave a sniff. "I'll tell you something else," he said. "I can smell hot chestnuts." Paddington licked his lips. Although it wasn't long since he'd had his tea, all the excitement was beginning to make him feel hungry again. "Hot chestnuts, Mr. Brown?" he exclaimed with interest. "I don't think I've ever had any of those before." The Browns stopped in their tracks and for the second time that day stared at Paddington in amazement. "You've never had any hot chestnuts?" repeated Mr. Brown. Paddington shook his head. "Never," he said firmly. "Well, we can soon alter that," said Mr. Brown, leading the way towards a coke brazier at the side of the road. "7 large bags, please," he announced to the man who was serving. "What a good thing I brought my camera!" exclaimed Mr. Gruber. "2 firsts in one evening," he continued as he set up his tripod. "The decorations, and now this. I shall have to make some extra copies for your Aunt Lucy in Peru, Mr. Brown. I expect she'll find them most interesting." Paddington thanked his friend happily through a mouthful of hot chestnuts. In the distance, he could still see some decorations in the busy shopping part of London, while in front, the biggest tree he'd ever seen in his life rose up into the night, supporting a myriad of brightly coloured fairy lights, and from somewhere nearby, the sound of a Christmas carol filled the air. All in all, he thought it had been a lovely evening out, and it was nice to think that Christmas Day itself was still to come. But also, to round things off in such a tasty manner was splendid. "Are you having trouble with your exposures, Mr. Gruber?" he asked, hopefully, as he came to the end of his chestnuts. Mr. Gruber looked up in some surprise. "I only wondered," said Paddington hastily, eyeing the brazier before his friend had time to reply, "because if you are, I thought perhaps you'd like me to have another bag just to make sure." "Oh, there's one thing about bears," said Mrs. Bird, joining in the laughter which followed Paddington's last remark. "They certainly don't believe in taking any chances." Mr. Brown reached into his pocket. "And for once," he said, amid general agreement, "I'm entirely on their side. 7 more bags, please." I know it's none of my business, said Mrs. Bird, pausing for a moment as she cleared the breakfast table. But do you think Mr. Curry's suddenly come into some money? She nodded towards the next-door garden. He's out there practising with his golf clubs again this morning. That's the third time this week. Mrs. Brown looked just as puzzled as her housekeeper as she considered Mr. Curry's strange behaviour. Apart from having a reputation for meanness, the Browns' neighbour was also noted for his bad temper and unsportsmanlike attitude generally. The idea of his taking up any sort of game was hard to picture, and when it was an expensive one like golf, then it became doubly so. I must say it's very strange, agreed Mrs. Brown, as the clear sound of a ball being hit by a club greeted her housekeeper's remarks. He seemed to be turning his lawn into a putting green yesterday, and he's got some +4s hanging on the line. Paddington, who until that moment had been busily engaged in finishing up the last of the toast and marmalade before Mrs. Bird removed it from the table, suddenly gave vent to a loud, choking noise. Mr. Curry's +4s are hanging on the line, he exclaimed when he'd recovered himself. He peered through the window with interest, but Mr. Curry's clothesline seemed very little different from any other day of the week. In fact, apart from a tea towel and jerseys, the only unusual item was a pair of very odd-looking trousers, which hung limp and bedraggled in the still morning air. Those are +4s, explained Mrs. Brown. They're special trousers people used to wear when they played golf. You don't see them very often nowadays. Oh, and that reminds me, she continued, turning away from the window. Henry asked me to get his golfing things out for him. There's an open day at the golf club on Saturday, and he wants to go. They're expecting quite a crowd. Arnold Parker's putting in a special appearance, and he's judging 1 or 2 competitions. I don't know whether Henry's going in for any of them, but apparently there are some quite big prizes. There's a special one for the person whose ball travels the farthest. Said Mrs. Bird as Mrs. Brown's voice trailed away. There's no need to say any more. That's one mystery solved. Trust Mr. Curry to be around when there's a chance of getting something for nothing, she snorted as she disappeared towards the kitchen with her tray. As Mrs. Brown picked up the remains of the crockery and followed her housekeeper out of the room, Paddington climbed up onto his chair and looked hopefully out of the window. But Mr. Curry was nowhere in sight. So he climbed back down again, and a few minutes later hurried out into the garden in order to investigate the matter more closely. In the past, he'd several times come across Mr. Brown's golf clubs in the cupboard under the stairs, but he'd never watched the game being played before, and the possibility of seeing Mr. Curry practising on his lawn and being able to take a closer look at his +4s into the bargain seemed an opportunity too good to be missed. Crouching down to the ground behind Mr. Brown's shed, he put his eye to a special knot-hole in the fence which usually gave a very good view of the next-door garden. But to his surprise, there was nothing to be seen but a wall of blackness. Looking most disappointed, Paddington picked up one of Mr. Brown's old bean sticks and poked it hopefully through the hole in an attempt to unblock it. As he did so, a loud cry of pain suddenly rang out, and he nearly fell over backwards with surprise as the familiar figure of the Browns' neighbour suddenly rose into view on the other side of the fence. "Bear!" roared Mr. Curry as he danced up and down, clutching his right eye. "Did you do that on purpose, Bear?" Hastily letting go of the stick, Paddington jumped back in alarm. "Oh, no, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed. I was only trying to unblock the hole. If I'd known you were there, I'd have done it much more gently. I mean..." "What's that?" bellowed Mr. Curry. "What did you say?" Paddington gave up trying to explain what he meant as the face on the other side of the fence turned a deep purple. "I wanted to see your sun trousers, Mr. Curry," he said unhappily. "My what trousers?" repeated Mr. Curry. "Your some trousers, Mr. Curry, the ones you played golf in." Mr. Curry gave Paddington a searching look with his good eye. "If you mean my +4s, why don't you say so, Bear?" he growled. Removing his hand from the other eye, he glared suspiciously across the fence. "I was looking for my golf ball. It went over into your garden." Anxious to make amends, Paddington looked round Mr. Brown's garden and almost immediately spied a small white object nestling among the tomato plants. "Here it is, Mr. Curry," he called. "I think it's broken one of Mr. Brown's stems." "Well, if people don't take the trouble to build their fences high enough, they must expect these things," said Mr. Curry nastily as he took the ball. "I didn't realise you were interested in golf, Bear," he remarked casually. "I'm looking for someone to act as caddy for me in the golf competition tomorrow," he said, lowering his voice. "I have some very expensive equipment, and I need someone reliable to take charge of it all. If I find the right person," he continued meaningly, "I might not report whoever it is for nearly poking my eye out with a stick." "Thank you very much, Mr. Curry," began Paddington even more doubtfully. Almost before the words were out of his mouth, Mr. Curry rubbed his hands together. "Good! That's settled then," he said briskly. "I'll see you on the links at 2 o'clock sharp. Mind you," he added sternly as he turned to go, "if I let you do it, I shall hold you responsible for everything. If any of my balls get lost, you'll have to buy me new ones." Paddington stared unhappily after the retreating figure in the next-door garden. He wasn't at all sure what duties a caddy had on a golf course, but from the tone of Mr. Curry's last remarks he had a nasty feeling that, not for the first time, he was getting the worst of the bargain. In the event, his worst fears were realised, and any ideas he might have entertained of actually having a go himself were quickly dashed the following day when he met Mr. Curry at the entrance to the golf course. The Browns' neighbour wasn't in a very good mood, and as the afternoon wore on and Paddington laboured wearily up hill and down dale, struggling with the bag of clubs, his hopes grew fainter still. Mr. Curry seemed to spend most of his time climbing in and out of one or other of the many bunkers scattered about the 18 holes on the golf course, his temper getting shorter and shorter, and Paddington was thankful when at long last the spot where the big competition of the day was being held came into view, and they stood waiting their turn to start. "You'll have to keep your eyes skinned here, Bear," growled Mr. Curry, surveying the fairway. "I shall be hitting the ball very hard, and you mustn't lose sight of it. I don't want it getting mixed up with anyone else's." "It's all right, Mr. Curry," said Paddington eagerly. "I've put a special mark on the side with some marmalade peel." "Marmalade peel?" echoed Mr. Curry. "Are you sure it won't come off?" "I don't think so, Mr. Curry," replied Paddington confidently. "It's some of my special marmalade, from the cut-price grocers in the market. Mrs. Bird always says their chunks never come off anything." Paddington glanced around while he was explaining what he'd done. Quite a large crowd had gathered to watch the event, and he felt most important as he leaned nonchalantly on Mr. Curry's club in the way that he'd seen Arnold Parker do in some of the many posters advertising the event. Even Mr. Curry himself began to look slightly better pleased with things in general as he took in the scene around them. "Of course, Bear," he announced in a loud voice for the benefit of some nearby spectators. "Of course I've only been practising so far, getting my hand in, so to speak. It's a long time since I played golf, so I've been saving myself for this event. Now, when I go up to get my prize, I would like you—" Mr. Curry's voice broke off, and whatever else he had been about to say was lost for posterity, as a loud crack rent the air, and Paddington suddenly rolled over onto the grass, clutching a short length of stick in his paw. "Bear!" bellowed Mr. Curry. For once, words deserted him as he pointed a trembling finger at the broken end of his golf club. Paddington sat up and peered unhappily at the two jagged pieces. "Perhaps you could tie them together, Mr. Curry," he said hopefully. "Tie them together?" spluttered Mr. Curry. "Tie them together? My best driver? I'll... Now look here." A voice at Mr. Curry's elbow broke into the argument. "Look here, if anyone's owed an apology, it's this young bear. From the way you were playing earlier on, I'm not surprised that club snapped. It's a wonder there wasn't a nasty accident. And if this is your best one, I must say I wouldn't care to see your worst. It's all rusty." The owner of the voice looked distastefully at the remains of Mr. Curry's club, and then bent down to give Paddington a hand. "My name's Parker," he announced. "Arnold Parker. I'm acting as judge here this afternoon." "Thank you very much, Mr. Parker," said Paddington, looking most impressed at having such a famous person help him to his feet. "My name's Brown. Paddington Brown." "Arnold Parker?" repeated Mr. Curry. The cross expression on his face disappeared as if by magic. "I was only joking," he said, creasing his face into a smile as he reached into his golf bag. "These things happen. I do have another driver. It's a much heavier one, of course. I only keep it for when I'm playing in important matches. But still, remind me to give you 5p when we get home, Bear," he added in a loud voice for the benefit of Arnold Parker. Paddington blinked at the Brown's neighbour in amazement. It was most unlike him to want to pay out 5p at the end of a hard day's work, let alone offer one without so much as being asked. "Do you happen to have my tea handy, Bear?" asked Mr. Curry, as he took up his position at the start. "Your tea, Mr. Curry?" repeated Paddington. Taken even more by surprise at this sudden request, he reached hastily under his hat in an effort to make amends for his accident and withdrew a marmalade sandwich. Mr. Curry took the sandwich, looked at it for a moment as if he could hardly believe his eyes, and then threw it on the ground. "I don't mean that sort of tea, Bear," he growled, his smile becoming even more fixed than before. "I mean the kind you place the ball on." Taking a deep breath, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object made of yellow plastic, which he pushed into the ground in front of him. Balancing Paddington's specially marked ball on top of the tee, Mr. Curry stood back, took careful aim along the fairway, swung the new club over his shoulder, and then, to everybody's surprise, gave a loud yell as in one continuous movement he turned head over heels like a Catherine wheel. "Oh, dear," said Arnold Parker. He bent down and examined something on the ground. "I think you must have accidentally trodden on Mr. Brown's marmalade sandwich." The golf club was situated close to a railway line, and fortunately for the ears of the onlookers in general, and Paddington in particular, Mr. Curry's remarks for the next few minutes as he sat digesting this piece of information were drowned by the noise of a passing train. "Marmalade!" he exclaimed. "All over my best +4s." He sat up, rubbing his leg. "And I've hurt myself," he groaned. "Now I shan't be able to play." Arnold Parker began to look rather concerned as Mr. Curry screwed up his face. "If I were you, I'd go along to the first aid tent," he said. "It may be serious." "Bear!" roared Mr. Curry. "It's all your fault, Bear, leaving marmalade sandwiches lying around like that." "Nonsense," said Arnold Parker, coming to Paddington's rescue again. "If you hadn't thrown it down in the first place, it would never have happened. It's a judgment." "Perhaps I could have a go for you, Mr. Curry," said Paddington eagerly. Arnold Parker looked at him thoughtfully. "Well, there's no reason why not," he said, turning to Mr. Curry. It doesn't say anything in the rules about bears being barred, and it'll save you losing your entrance money. Mr. Curry pricked up his ears at this last piece of information. He glared at Paddington and then, swallowing hard, handed over his club. "All right, Bear," he said, ungraciously. "I suppose it's better than nothing, but mind you make a good job of it. And make sure you address the ball properly," he barked as Paddington took up his position. "Make sure I address the ball properly, Mr. Curry?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most surprised. "I don't even know where it's going." "I think he's worried about your stance, Mr. Brown," said Arnold Parker soothingly. "My stamps?" echoed Paddington, growing more and more confused. Looking at Mr. Curry's ball, there didn't seem much room for even a short address, let alone a stamp as well. And he was most relieved when Arnold Parker explained that addressing the ball was only another way of saying you were getting ready to hit it, and that stance simply described the way you stood. Paddington looked around at the crowd. It seemed to him that golfers used a lot of very complicated words to describe the simple act of hitting a small white ball with a club. Taking hold of Mr. Curry's club, he closed his eyes, and to the accompaniment of a gasp of alarm from some of the nearby spectators, swung the club with all his might. Perhaps you could try standing a little nearer," said Arnold Parker, after a few minutes and quite a number of goes had passed by without anything happening. He looked at his watch, and then at the queue of waiting competitors. "It must be a bit difficult with paws," he added encouragingly. Paddington mopped his brow and stared at the ball in disgust. He felt there were several improvements he could make to the game of golf, not the least of which would be to have a bigger ball. All the same, he was a determined bear, and after deciding to have one last try, he closed his eyes again, gripped the club as hard as he could, and took a final swing. This time there was a satisfying crack as the end of the club made contact with the ball. "4!" shouted someone in the crowd behind him. "5!" exclaimed Paddington, nearly falling over in his excitement. "Congratulations," said Arnold Parker as he picked himself up off the ground. "Did anyone see where it went?" "I did," shouted Mr. Curry above the noise of a passing goods train. "Over there!" He pointed towards a large piece of scrubland between the tee and the railway line, and then turned back to Paddington. "Bear," he said, slowly and carefully, "I'm going to the first aid tent now to get my legs seen to. If you haven't found my ball by the time I get back, I'll... The Brown's neighbour left his sentence unfinished as he hobbled away, but the expression on his face more than made up for any lack of words, and Paddington's heart sank as he bade goodbye to Arnold Parker, and made his way slowly in the direction of the railway line. From a distance, the patch of land had looked bad enough, full of long grass and brambles, but now that he was close to it, Paddington decided he wouldn't fancy his chances of finding a football, let alone anything as small as a golf ball. And even the sight of a friendly train driver waving in his direction as the engine disappeared round a bend failed to cheer him up as he settled down to his unwelcome task. Mr. Curry sat up in bed in the casualty ward of the hospital and stared in amazement at the shiny new bag of golf clubs. "Do you mean to say that I won these?" he said. "Paddington won them," replied Mrs. Bird firmly, "and now he's very kindly giving them to you." "Well, thank you very much, Bear," said Mr. Curry gruffly. "Fancy you hitting a ball farther than anyone else." "He didn't exactly hit it, Father," said Jonathan, nudging his sister. "It only travelled farther, but Arnold Parker said it was probably a world record all the same." "Especially for a bear," added Judy, squeezing Paddington's paw. "A world record? Mr. Curry began to look even more impressed as he listened to the others. "Very good, Bear. Very good indeed." He fingered his new clubs and then looked thoughtfully at the new practice ball. "Makes me want to have a go." "I shouldn't if I were you," said Mrs. Brown anxiously, reading Mr. Curry's thoughts. "You don't want another accident?" "Nonsense!" exclaimed Mr. Curry, sticking his legs out of the bed. "They're letting me out soon. I feel better already." He bent down, placed the ball in the middle of the polished floor, and then, before anyone could stop him, took careful aim with one of his new clubs. "One go won't do any—" Mr. Curry's voice broke off, and for a second he seemed to disappear in a flurry of arms and legs. Then a loud crash shook the ward. "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan. "Not again!" "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We did warn you." "Nurse!" bellowed Mr. Curry as he sat up, rubbing his injured leg. "Nurse! Where are you? Who left all this polish on the floor?" The Browns exchanged glances as the doors burst open and a crowd of figures in white, led by a lady in a sister's uniform, rushed into the ward. "I think we'd better beat a hasty retreat," said Mr. Brown, voicing the thoughts of them all. "It certainly wasn't Paddington's fault that time," said Mrs. Bird firmly. "You know what Mr. Curry's like," said Mrs. Brown. "Can't we tell him the rest of the story?" asked Jonathan. Mr. Brown shook his head. "I think it'll have to wait," he said, trying to make himself heard above the hubbub. "Anyway, I don't suppose he'll believe us." Mrs. Brown took one last look at the crowd round Mr. Curry's bed as she led the way up the ward. 9 miles does sound a long way for a golf ball to go, she agreed. What a good job the rules didn't say anything about how it travelled. "Fancy landing in a cab of a railway engine," said Jonathan. "No wonder the driver was waving at you." "It was jolly good of him to have it sent back," added Judy. "What do you think, Paddington?" Paddington considered the matter for a moment. "I think," he said, "I think it's a good job I put a marmalade chunk on the side of the ball to mark it. Otherwise, no one would have known it was mine." Mrs. Brown gave a sigh as she searched through her kitchen drawer for an elastic band. "If I see another jar of calf's foot jelly," she exclaimed with unusual vigour, "I shall scream. That's the 4th one this week. Not to mention 3 pots of jam, 2 dozen eggs, and goodness knows how many bunches of grapes." Mrs. Bird gave a snort. "If you ask me," she said grimly, "Mr. Curry will be coming out of hospital when it suits him and not a minute before. He knows when he's onto a good thing. Free board and lodging and everyone at his beck and call. He has a relapse every time the doctor says he's getting better." The Browns' housekeeper took the elastic band from Mrs. Brown and gave it a hard ping as she released it round the neck of the jar. From the expression on her face, it looked as if Mr. Curry could consider himself lucky that he wasn't within range. It was a little over a week since the Browns' neighbour had been admitted to hospital after his accident on the golf course, and although the X-rays and a number of probings from various doctors had revealed nothing amiss, he still maintained he couldn't move his leg. Since then, the Browns had received a constant stream of postcards, notes, and other messages containing urgent requests for things ranging from best grapes to newspapers, magazines, writing paper, stamps, and other items too numerous to mention. At first, they'd only been too pleased to oblige, and with Jonathan and Judy back at school after the summer holidays, Paddington, in particular, had spent a great deal of his time rushing round the market with his shopping basket on wheels, seeing to Mr. Curry's various wants. But after a week of visiting and listening to his complaints, their enthusiasm was beginning to wear decidedly thin. Even the hospital staff were becoming restive, and the ward sister herself had made some very pointed remarks about the shortage of beds. "I am not having him here," said Mrs. Bird flatly. "That's final, and I'm certainly not having Paddington run about after him once he's home. He'll be wearing that poor bear's paws to the bone." Paddington, who happened to arrive in the kitchen at that moment, gave a start and looked hastily at his paws. But to his relief, there was no sign of anything poking through his pads, and so he turned his attention to the basket of food standing on the table. "Now, you're sure you'll be all right?" asked Mrs. Brown as she carefully wedged a fruitcake into the last remaining space. Paddington licked his lips. "I think so, Mrs. Brown," he said. "And no picking the cherries out of the cake on the way," warned Mrs. Bird, reading his thoughts. "If Mr. Curry finds any holes, we should be getting another postcard, and I've had quite enough for 1 week." Paddington looked most offended at the suggestion. "Pick cherries out of Mr. Curry's cake?" he exclaimed. Mrs. Brown broke in hastily. "Explain to him that we can't come tonight," she said. "We are all going out. Now, there's no need to stay for more than 5 minutes. They don't usually allow visiting in the morning, but Mrs. Bird rang the sister in charge of the ward, and she said it would be all right just this once." Paddington listened carefully to all his instructions. In his heart of hearts, he wasn't too keen on visiting Mr. Curry by himself. All his visits since the accident had been with other members of the Brown family, and he had a nasty feeling that their neighbour might have 1 or 2 things to say on the subject of the golf match. So he brightened at the news that he wouldn't have to stay long. Mrs. Brown had arranged for a taxi to call and take Paddington to the hospital, and a few minutes later, armed with the basket, together with a small parcel of sandwiches and a thermos flask of hot cocoa in case he got delayed and missed his 11s, he put on his duffel coat and set off. As the taxi disappeared round the corner of Windsor Gardens, Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird turned and went back inside the house. "I do hope we're doing the right thing, letting him go by himself," sighed Mrs. Brown as she closed the front door. "I shouldn't worry about that bear," said Mrs. Bird decidedly. "He knows how to look after number 1. Mrs. Brown gave another sigh. "It wasn't Paddington I was thinking of. It's the hospital." Now, Mr. Curry had been admitted to a hospital not far from Windsor Gardens. It was a busy establishment, and Mrs. Brown shuddered to think of what might happen if Paddington took the wrong turning and got lost in one of its many corridors. However, it was much too late to worry, for it was only a matter of minutes before Paddington's taxi swung off the main road, passed through some large gates, and drew to a halt at the main entrance to a large brick building. Paddington didn't often have the chance to travel in a taxi, especially by himself, and he was slightly disappointed that it was all over so quickly. Nevertheless, he felt most important as he climbed out onto the forecourt, and after thanking the driver for the ride, made his way through the entrance doors towards a desk marked Reception. "Mr. Curry," said the uniformed man behind the desk, and he ran his finger down a long list clipped to a board. "Mr. Curry. I don't recollect anyone of that name. Have you an appointment?" "Oh, yes," said Paddington. "Mrs. Bird made one specially." The receptionist scratched his head. "Any idea what he does?" he asked. "This is a big hospital, you know. We've all sorts of people here." Paddington thought for a moment. "I don't think he does anything very much," he said at last, "except grumble." "Well, that doesn't help a lot," said the man. "We've got 1 or 2 like that round here, I can tell you." "What's your name, please?" "Brown," said Paddington promptly. "Paddington Brown, from number 32 Windsor Gardens." The receptionist riffled through some more papers. "I can't find any bears down for an appointment either, let alone brown ones," he said at last. "I think I'd better pass you on to our Mr. Grant. He deals with all the difficult cases." "Thank you very much," said Paddington gratefully. "Is he the head man?" "That's right," said the receptionist, picking up a telephone. He was about to dial a number when he paused and looked at Paddington. "The head man," he repeated, his face clearing. "Bless me, why didn't you say so before? You want the psychiatrist." Seeing Paddington's look of surprise, he leaned over his desk. "That's the chap who looks after things up here," he said, tapping his own head as he lowered his voice confidentially. "What we call the head shrinker." Paddington began to look more and more astonished as he listened. Although he was very keen on long words, he'd never heard of one as long as psychiatrist before. And even if his hat did feel a bit tight sometimes, particularly when he had a marmalade sandwich inside it, he wasn't at all sure that he wanted to cure it by having his head shrunk. "I think I'd rather have my hat stretched instead," he announced with growing alarm. It was the man's turn to look surprised as he took in Paddington's words. From where he was standing there was a very odd look about the figure on the other side of the desk, and although he couldn't find any trace of an appointment in the name of Brown, he felt sure if the present conversation was anything to go by, that for once the rules could be bypassed. Paddington had a very hard stare when he liked, and backing away slightly, the receptionist hastily consulted another list. There, he said. "There's nothing to worry about. I'll try and arrange for you to see our Mr. Hines." "Mr. Hines?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "But I wanted to see Mr. Curry. I brought him one of Mrs. Bird's cherry cakes." Reaching for a walking stick, the man looked anxiously over his shoulder as he came round the front of the desk. "I think you'll find Mr. Hines much nicer," he said, eyeing Paddington warily. Realizing the expression head shrinker had been a bit upsetting, not to mention the word psychiatrist, he tried hard to think of another name. "He's our best trick cyclist," he added soothingly. "Just follow me." Apart from the time when he'd spilt some hot toffee down his front by mistake and then had been unable to stand up again after it set, Paddington hadn't had a lot to do with hospitals. Even so, he looked most surprised to hear they had such things as trick cyclists for the entertainment of visitors. It sounded very good value indeed, and he looked around with interest as he followed the man towards a door at the far end of a long corridor. Motioning Paddington to wait, the man disappeared into the room. For a few moments there was the sound of a muffled conversation, and then the door opened again. "You're in luck," whispered the receptionist. "Mr. Hines can see you straight away. He's got a free period." Taking hold of Paddington's spare paw, he propelled him through the door and then hastily closed it behind him. After the brightness of the corridor, the room seemed unusually dark. The slatted blinds were drawn over the windows, and the only light came from a green-shaded lamp on a desk at the far side. Apart from some cabinets and several chairs, there was a long couch, rather like a padded table, in the middle of the room, and behind the desk itself, Paddington made out the dim figure of a man in a white coat, who appeared to be examining him through a pair of unusually thick-lensed glasses. Come in, said the man, turning the lamp so that it shone on Paddington's face. "Take off your coat and make yourself comfortable." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, blinking in the strong light. He felt very pleased that he was the first one in, and taking off his duffel coat and hat, he placed them on top of his basket and then settled himself down in a nearby chair. "Have I got long to wait?" he asked, unwrapping his sandwiches.
"Oh, no,"
said the man in the white coat. He picked up a pen.
"In fact, I'll start right away."
"I'm sorry about the cherry cake," said Paddington cheerfully. Mr. Hynes put his pen down again. Taking off his glasses, he breathed on the lenses, polished them with a handkerchief, and then replaced them on his nose.
"You are sorry about your cherry cake?"
he repeated carefully. Paddington nodded. "I'm afraid I can't let you have a slice," he said, "because Mrs. Bird doesn't want any more postcards from Mr. Curry, but you can have one of my marmalade sandwiches if you like." Mr. Hynes gave a slight shudder as he waved aside the open bag.
"Very kind of you," he said briefly, "but..."
He paused.
"Is anything the matter?"
he inquired, as Paddington began peering anxiously around the room. It's all right, thank you, Mr. Hynes," said Paddington, turning his attention back to the man behind the desk. "I was only wondering where you keep your bike."
"My bike?"
Mr. Hynes rose from his chair and came round to the front of the desk.
"This is really a most interesting case," he exclaimed, rubbing his hands together. "The receptionist said,
He broke off as Paddington gave him a hard stare.
"That is, I may even write an article about it," he continued hastily. "I don't think I've had any bear patients before."
Helping Paddington to his feet, Mr. Hynes motioned him towards the couch in the middle of the room.
"I'd like you to lie on that," he said, "and then look up towards the ceiling and try to make your mind a blank."
Paddington examined the couch with interest. "Thank you very much," he exclaimed doubtfully as he clambered up. "But shall I be able to see your tricks?"
"My tricks?"
repeated Mr. Hynes. "The man in the hall said you were going to do some tricks," explained Paddington, beginning to look rather disappointed that nothing much was happening.
Well, I expect he was trying to to keep you happy," said Mr. Hynes, making his way back to the desk. "As a matter of fact," he continued casually, "as a matter of fact, I'd like to play a little game. It's really to test your reactions."
"A game to test my reactions?" repeated Paddington, looking more and more surprised. "I didn't know I had any."
"Oh, yes, everyone has reactions. Some people have fast ones and some have slow."
He picked up his pen again.
"Now, I am going to call out some words quite quickly, and each time I call one out, I want you to give me another one which has the opposite meaning. Right?"
"Wrong," said Paddington promptly. Mr. Hynes paused with his pen halfway to the paper.
"What's the matter?" he asked crossly. "Aren't you comfortable?"
"Oh, yes," said Paddington. "But you told me to say the opposite every time you gave me a word." He sat up and gave the man behind the desk another hard stare. For someone who was supposed to be testing reactions, he didn't think much of Mr. Hynes's own ones at all. For some unknown reason, Mr. Hynes appeared to be counting under his breath.
"That wasn't the word, bear," he said, breathing heavily. "Wait until I give you the go-ahead. Once you start, I don't want to hear anything else. I'll give you a countdown beginning now. 3, 2, 1, go!"
"Stop," said Paddington. Mr. Hynes opened his mouth and then appeared to change his mind.
"Very good," he said grudgingly.
"Very bad," replied Paddington eagerly.
"Look here,"
began Mr. Hynes, a note of panic in his voice. "Look there!" cried Paddington wildly. Much as he'd been looking forward to seeing Mr. Hynes do some tricks on his bicycle, he was beginning to think that the present game was much more interesting, and he looked most disappointed when his last reply was greeted with silence. "Can't you think of any more words, Mr. Hynes?" he asked. The psychiatrist spent a moment or two drumming on his desk with his fingers. He looked as if there were a number of words he would like to have said, but ignoring the temptation, he picked up his pen again.
"White,"
he said wearily.
"black,"
said Paddington, settling down again on the couch with his paws crossed and a pleased expression on his face.
Big,
said Mr. Hynes, hopefully. Small, said Paddington promptly.
fast,
said Mr. Hynes. Slow, said Paddington. Trying several more words in quick succession, Mr. Hynes began to look better pleased with the way things were going, and for several minutes his pen raced across the paper as he tried to keep pace with Paddington's replies.
Fine,
he said at last, leaning back in his chair. Wet, exclaimed Paddington. Mr. Hynes gave a chuckle.
We've finished.
We've started.
No, we haven't.
Yes, we have.
No, no, no.
Yes, yes, yes.
Will you stop?
Yelled Mr. Hynes. No, I won't, cried Paddington, nearly falling off the couch in his excitement. Mr. Hynes looked wildly about the room.
Why did I ever take this up?
He cried, burying his face in his hands.
I should have had my head examined.
Paddington sat up, looking most surprised at the last remark. Perhaps it needs shrinking, he said, peering at Mr. Hynes's head with interest. I should go and see the man in the hall. He might be able to help you. He knows all about these things. As Paddington began clambering down off the couch, Mr. Hynes made a dash for the door.
I shall be gone for 5 minutes, he announced dramatically. 5 minutes! And if you are still here when I get back...
Mr. Hynes left his sentence unfinished, but from the way he punctuated it with the slam of the door, even Paddington could see that he wasn't best pleased at the way things had gone. Paddington peered at the closed door for several moments, and then hastily gathered up his belongings. There was another door leading out of Mr. Hynes's room, and after considering the matter, Paddington decided to investigate this one instead of the door he'd come in by. There had been a rather nasty expression on Mr. Hynes's face when he'd left, one which he hadn't liked the look of at all, and whatever lay on the other side of the second door, Paddington felt sure it couldn't be worse than the possibility of meeting the hospital's trick cyclist again. Paddington closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, mopping his brow. All in all, he felt he'd had a narrow escape. He wasn't quite sure what he'd escaped from, but he hadn't liked the look of things in the next room at all, and he was glad he'd decided to retire from the scene. He felt even more pleased a few seconds later when the muffled sound of voices broke out on the other side of the wall. From what he could make out through the keyhole, there appeared to be some sort of argument going on, and several times he distinctly heard Mr. Hynes thumping his desk. Gradually, however, the noise died away, and at long last he was able to turn his attention to his new surroundings. After the previous room, it was slightly disappointing. Apart from an old hat stand laden with white coats, the only items of furniture were a desk, on top of which was an open bag containing a number of instruments, a swivel chair, and a big steel rack which seemed to hold a lot of large photographic negatives, and which occupied most of one wall alongside a second door. It wasn't a bit like some of the rooms he'd seen in hospital programmes on television, with people rushing in and out, pushing trolleys and barking out orders. That apart, it was also a very cold room. From his few short visits to hospitals, Paddington had noticed that they were very keen on fresh air, and Mr. Curry's was no exception. There were 3 windows in the room, all much too high to reach, and all of them wide open. Paddington began to feel pleased that Mrs. Bird had thought to provide him with a thermos flask full of hot cocoa in case he got delayed, and after several minutes had passed with no sign of anything happening, he undid the top and poured some of the liquid into the cup. A moment later, Paddington let out a yell which echoed and re-echoed round the room as he danced up and down, waving the cup with one paw and clutching his mouth with the other. Mrs. Bird was a great believer in making hot things as hot as possible, and for once even she had excelled herself. Hastily pouring the remains of the cocoa back into the thermos, Paddington replaced the top and then began peering inside the bag on the desk in the hope of finding a mirror so that he could examine the end of his tongue. It was while he was doing this that a thoughtful expression gradually came over his face. In the past, he'd often watched programmes about hospitals on television. In fact, he was very keen on some of them, particularly the ones where there was a lot of action. And he recognised several instruments in the bag as being identical to the ones Grant Dexter always carried when he made his rounds every Monday evening in the Daredevil Doctor series. Gradually, an ominous quiet descended on the room. A quiet broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and an occasional chink as Paddington investigated still deeper into the bag. It was some while later that the door leading to the corridor slowly opened, and a small figure dressed entirely in white peered out through the gap. The corridor was empty, but even if there had been anyone around, little but the closest inspection would have revealed the identity of the face behind the mask as it looked furtively one way and then the other. In fact, other than the unusual appearance of the coat, which reached right down to the floor, even Grant Dexter himself might have been forgiven if he'd met the wearer face to face and thought he was looking at a shortened version of his own reflection in a mirror. Apart from the mask, the head was almost completely enveloped in a white skull cap, and this in turn was surmounted by a headband and lamp. A stethoscope was draped around the neck, and although a few whiskers, which had obstinately refused to stay folded, poked out through some gaps and might have provided a clue, the rest of the face was almost entirely hidden. Having carefully made sure no one was coming, Paddington closed the door again and turned his attention to the photographic plates hanging on the wall. Holding them up to the light in the way he'd seen Grant Dexter do many times before on television, he peered at them hopefully. But after a few minutes he changed his mind and decided to sit down in the chair behind the desk instead. As pictures, they'd been most disappointing. As far as he could make out, most of them showed a lot of old bones, and half of those were broken. The swivel chair was much more interesting, and he spent some time swinging it round and round, gradually getting higher and higher until he was almost level with the top of the desk. Waving his paws wildly in the air in the way that Mr. Hynes had done, Paddington was about to give the chair a final heave when suddenly the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and he found himself flying through the air. Everything went black for a moment, and then he landed in a heap on the floor with what appeared to be a ton weight on top of him. As he struggled to remove the weight, Paddington heard a patter of running feet in the corridor outside, and then the door suddenly burst open and a man in uniform rushed into the room. "Where is it? Where is it?" he cried, taking aim with a large red fire extinguisher. Paddington paused in his efforts to free himself. "Where is it?" he repeated in surprise. "Blimey!" The man looked down at the figure on the floor. "Are you all right, sir? I thought there'd been an explosion or something. One of them gas cylinders going up." Paddington thought for a moment. "I think I'm all right, but the room's still going round." "I'm not surprised," said the man, examining the wreckage. "Your seat's come off." Paddington looked round. "My seat's come off?" "Yes, probably ran out of thread," explained the man as he bent down to lend a helping hand. "I expect you was turning it round and round too quickly and broke the end stop." He paused as he caught sight of a coloured badge in Paddington's lapel. "Here, are you one of them gentlemen from overseas?" Paddington looked at him in amazement. "I come from darkest Peru," he said. "Thought so by your badge," said the man. "Oh, well, we all know who you want to see, don't we?" "Do we?" exclaimed Paddington, looking more and more surprised. "I expect Mrs. Bird rang up." The man paused for a moment, as if he hadn't heard aright. "I think you'd best come along with me," he said at last, giving Paddington a very odd look. Working in a large London hospital, he'd become used to seeing strange sights, but somehow Now that he was able to get a better view, the figure standing in front of him surpassed even his previous experience. We don't want to keep his nibs waiting," he continued, hastily opening the door. "He don't like it much." "I know he doesn't," agreed Paddington, looking pleased that at long last someone understood that he'd come to see Mr. Curry. "Thank you very much." The man looked at Paddington in astonishment as he picked up his basket. "Here, you're not taking that in with you, are you?" "I brought it for him," explained Paddington. "Oh, well," said the man, scratching his head, "have it your own way, but don't say I didn't warn you. Oh, and if you want my advice, you'll take them gloves off before you go in the ward." "Take my gloves off?" exclaimed Paddington hotly as the man disappeared up the corridor. "Those aren't gloves. They're paws." Taking a firm grip of the basket, he hurried after the man in uniform, giving the back of his head some very hard stares indeed, as they passed through several sets of swing doors, along another corridor, and finally into a large, brightly lit room with a row of beds on either side. Paddington peered down the ward. "There's Mr. Curry," he said excitedly, waving his paw in the direction of a bed at the far end. "I can see his grapes." "I dare say it is," said his guide, putting his finger to his lips as a tall, imposing figure rose from a group gathered around a nearby bed and fixed his eye on them. "And that's Sir Archibald. I can see his glares." "Sir Archibald?" repeated Paddington in surprise. "That's right," said the man, looking pleased. "We're just in time. He's still doing his rounds. Look, you come from overseas, right?" "Right," said Paddington promptly. "And you has a badge in your lapel, right?" "Right," agreed Paddington, rather more doubtfully as he looked down at his coat collar. "In that case," said the man patiently, "you must be one of Sir Archibald's students. He takes them on his rounds every Monday morning, and if I were you," he whispered, giving Paddington an encouraging push, "if I were you, I'd go and make my apologies to him before I was very much older. He don't look best pleased to my way of thinking." Thanking the man for his trouble, Paddington picked up his basket again and hurried down the ward. He wasn't at all sure who Sir Archibald was or why he had to apologise to him, but as he drew near and caught sight of the expression on Sir Archibald's face, he had to admit that the porter was right about the great man's mood, and he hastily lifted the top part of his skull-cap and let it drop back into place before he bade him good morning. "Good afternoon's more like it," barked Sir Archibald. He glared at Paddington's outfit with a look of disgust. "It's ward rounds today, not operations. You'll be frightening the patients out of their whips. Now you are here," he continued sarcastically, pointing to the patient under examination. "Now you are here, perhaps you can give us the benefit of your advice. Let's have your diagnosis." "My diagnosis?" exclaimed Paddington in alarm as he began unloading his basket. "There's a cherry cake and some calf's foot jelly, but I don't think Mrs. Bird mentioned one of those." "Calf's foot jelly?" repeated Sir Archibald, as if in a dream. "Did you say calf's foot jelly?" "Grant Dexter said it's always very good if you're ill," said Paddington. "Grant Dexter," spluttered Sir Archibald. "And who might he be?" "You don't know Grant Dexter?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most surprised. "He's in the Daredevil Doctor every Monday. He's very good at curing people. All his patients get better." "I think he'd like to know what you feel about this patient," hissed one of the other doctors, pointing to the man on the bed as a loud snort came from the direction of Sir Archibald. "Have a listen on your stethoscope," murmured someone else, reaching over to undo the man's pyjama jacket. "Do something." Paddington grew more and more confused as he listened to these crumbs of advice. Picking up a headset off the bed, he took the end of the stethoscope, which someone else handed him, and began hastily poking it on the man's chest as he listened hopefully. "Well," said Sir Archibald testily, "may we have your considered opinion?" Paddington removed the headset. "I can hear someone talking," he announced, looking most surprised. "It sounds like Desert Island Discs.
Desert Island Discs, bellowed Sir Archibald. You've picked up the radio headphones by mistake, hissed someone else behind Paddington. You're supposed to use the other end of the stethoscope. The patient sat up in bed and stared at Paddington with growing alarm. He's not going to operate, is he? 'Cause if he is, I'm going off home right sharpish. Rest assured, my dear sir, said Sir Archibald, it is most unlikely. He turned and glared at Paddington. As a doctor, you are a disgrace to your profession. Never in all my years. A doctor? Exclaimed Paddington, looking even more alarmed as he pulled off his mask. I'm not a doctor. I'm a bear. I've come to visit Mr. Curry. Sir Archibald seemed to grow visibly larger as he drew himself up to his full height. He took in a deep breath as if about to explode. And then something in Paddington's words caused him to pause. Curry, he repeated. Did you say curry? That's right, said Paddington. Are you a friend of his? Asked Sir Archibald. Well, he lives next door, said Paddington carefully, but I'm not really a friend. I've brought him something to be going on with. Sir Archibald snorted. That's the last thing he needs. That man is entirely without scruples. Mr. Curry's without scruples, repeated Paddington, looking most upset. I thought he'd only hurt his leg. Sir Archibald took a deep breath. Scruples, Bear, he said, are things that stop some people taking advantage of others. Oh, I don't think Mr. Curry's got any of those, Sir Archibald, agreed Paddington. Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because he takes advantage of others. Sir Archibald listened carefully as Paddington went on to explain all about the golf match and how Mr. Curry had persuaded him to act as caddy. Gradually, as the story unfolded, Sir Archibald's expression changed. When it was over, he gave a snort, and then, as he looked first up the ward towards Mr. Curry's bed and then at Paddington, a twinkle came into his eye. Are you any good at tricks, Bear? He asked thoughtfully. Oh, yes, Sir Archibald, said Paddington. Bears are very good at tricks. Thought you might be. Sir Archibald rubbed his hands together briskly and turned to the others. I have a feeling that this is one of those occasions when we don't stick to the book. We'll make the medicine fit the patient. Bending down to adjust Paddington's mask, he began whispering in his ear. It was difficult to tell what Paddington was thinking because his face was almost completely hidden again, but he nodded his head vigorously several times, and then a few moments later followed the famous surgeon up the ward in the direction of Mr. Curry's bed. Mr. Curry was reading a newspaper, but when he caught sight of Sir Archibald, he lowered it and gave vent to a loud groan. And how is the patient today? Asked Sir Archibald, removing a large bowl of grapes from the bed so that he could inspect Mr. Curry's leg. Worse, groaned Mr. Curry. Much worse. I thought you might be, said Sir Archibald cheerfully. That's why we've decided to operate. Operate? Echoed Mr. Curry, suddenly growing rather pale. Did you say operate? Sir Archibald nodded. It's no good playing around with these things, he said. I'd like to introduce you to, a colleague of mine from overseas. He specialises in legs, does something or other to the knee. Nobody quite knows what, but it seems to work very well in the jungle. Quite a few of his patients still manage to get around after a fashion. Mr. Curry stared uneasily at the small figure hovering by the side of the bed. Well, it's all right, said Sir Archibald, following his glance. There's no need to worry. We give him a box to stand on.
I don't suppose she'll want to shake hands, he added hastily, as Mr. Curry leaned over the side of the bed. His own are a bit shaky. But it was too late. A gleam of recognition came into Mr. Curry's eyes as he caught sight of Paddington's paw. "Bear!" he roared, recovering himself in record time. "Bear! Up to your tricks again!" Mr. Curry glared first at Paddington, who was looking slightly crestfallen behind his mask now that the plan had misfired, and then at Sir Archibald. "Tricks like this are very bad for patients," he said slowly and loudly for the benefit of everybody else in the ward. "I think I'm going to have another relapse." As Mr. Curry lay back, Paddington hastily pulled off his mask and lifted the basket of food onto the bed in an effort to make amends. "Careful, Bear," growled Mr. Curry. "Mind what you're doing with that cake. I don't want any crumbs in the bed, and no taking any of the grapes when I'm not looking. If I find any empty stalks, I shall know the reason why." He peered down his bed to where Paddington was busy unloading the basket. "Have you brought the—" Now, whatever else Mr. Curry had been about to say was lost for all time, as suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the ward shook with a tremendous roar of pain, and the sheets flew into the air as he jumped out of bed and started dancing up and down in the middle of the floor. "Bear!" he roared, lifting his injured leg into the air like an acrobat as he tried to rub his foot. "What have you done, Bear? Mr. Curry's voice trailed away, and for the second time within the space of as many seconds, he left a sentence unfinished as he gazed sheepishly round at the sea of faces. Sir Archibald turned to the sister in charge. "It seems to me," he said, breaking the silence which followed Mr. Curry's performance, "it seems to me we have another bed free in the ward after all." "You see, I don't think I could have screwed the top back on my flask properly, Mrs. Bird," explained Paddington. "It went all over Mr. Curry's foot." "Bear's cocoa," said Sir Archibald. "I haven't seen such a remarkable cure in years. It must be boiling hot, though." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird exchanged glances. So much had happened in the space of a few minutes they were feeling somewhat confused. First of all, their house had been shaken to the sound of Mr. Curry's front door being slammed. Then a large black car had drawn up outside number 32 Windsor Gardens, and to their amazement, Paddington had emerged from the back seat, closely followed by a distinguished-looking gentleman who was carrying the basket of food and the thermos flask. "All the best discoveries are made by accident," said Sir Archibald, seeing their look of puzzlement. "And in my experience, some of them take quite a lot of explaining afterwards." Sir Archibald turned to Paddington, and as he did so, a look of concern came over his face. "Are you all right, Bear?" he asked. Paddington felt under his coat with the end of the stethoscope he'd been given as a souvenir. "I think I'm having trouble with my beats, Sir Archibald," he announced faintly. Sir Archibald began to look even more concerned, and then he followed Paddington's eyes as they gazed hungrily at the shopping basket. "I think there's hope," he said gravely, turning back to the others. "Given plenty of cake and biscuits and some hot cocoa, that's most important." "It's funny you should say that," remarked Mrs. Bird. "I was just about to make some." She paused as Sir Archibald hovered wistfully in the doorway. "Would you care for a cup?" "I should not only care for one," said Sir Archibald. "I should consider it a great honour. After all," he added, "inventing cures is thirsty work, and bears aren't the only ones who like their 11s.